Well, this is the Dean Abbott podcast, and I'm talking tonight with Dr. Edward Perin. You say
Hello.
Perin, right?
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah. Who goes on Twitter by?
I'm at Dr. Perin.
Dr. Perin.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, we followed one another for probably 4 or 5 years, I would think now.
At least it's been a while.
And I just think of you as Ed.
Yeah,
And
you can call me Ed for this podcast. I'm okay with that.
Right. But it's funny how you can follow someone on Twitter for a long time and not even really know what their handle is necessarily.
That is funny, isn't it? Because I mean, they're real relationships.
Yes, that's the thing. And how has Twitter gone for you over the years?
Actually, I think that Twitter has been the best experience I've ever had with social media. Just at first, back when there was very few characters that you could post at any time, I saw it as a challenge. Like, what a great way to pack very complex ideas in such a small message. And I ended up developing communities, and even the DM groups. The best parts of Twitter happen in DM chat groups that aren't even public. I just think it's one of the best social media. I still call it Twitter. I guess it's X now, but right. I think it's the best social media out there.
It'll always be Twitter. Here on the Dean Abbott podcast, it will always be Twitter.
Well, I spent some time in Chicago, and I think they switched the Sears Tower to the Willis Tower while I lived there. And the entire city just all looked at each other and said, it's still the Sears Tower. No one's going to call it the Willis Tower.
I didn't even know that had changed. So
that's how well received the Sears Tower is. Yeah, it hasn't been called that for, I think, at least 6 or 7 years.
What would you say you notice about Twitter and sort of the end of Twitter, the neighborhood of Twitter that we tend to inhabit, in terms of the way it may have changed over the last few years, or even just the vibe? Have you noticed a vibe change?
Well, I think Twitter attracts a certain personality type. Typically people who are a little bit more verbal, or at least, maybe they have some verbal IQ. They can really express themselves really well with their words. But I also think it also attracts people who have like online presence. Like maybe they have a very common online world, or they spend a lot of their time online with online relationships, online communication, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, sometimes online work. And so I do think I do think Twitter controls for certain types of people. But one thing that I think really stands out in maybe our corner, which is maybe like a self-help corner or a self-improvement corner, is that kind of intersection with people who maybe do spend a lot of time online, who are very verbal, but also very much value transformation or self-improvement. So I do think that's really ramped up in the last 4 years. I think especially since I think even since Elon Musk has taken over, that has almost been amplified.
It's interesting when you think about it. I would say I follow now, I would say 95% of the same people I followed in 2017. But I feel like the feeling is so much more positive in a way than it was even a few years ago, at least in the corner that I'm part of. I think, one of the things I've talked about with guests on here many times is Twitter really is sort of the incubator of our cultural ideas now. And things that are now mainstream were talked about on Twitter 7 years ago. And I feel like we're in the middle of a big cultural shift. And a lot of that began really in the corners of Twitter that we inhabit, really. Um, Before, even in 2015, I remember when I thought there is no way Donald Trump could ever. Why is he even running? I mean, he's a comedic performer, right? And it was and a lot of people on Twitter at that point were very prescient and said, no, he's going to be the president.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think just on the political scene, what we're seeing right now in November of 2024 was kind of predicted in tweets years ago. And I feel like having that, seeing that cultural shift sort of testifies to how powerful what's happening there is.
Oh, I would actually agree with you because even regardless of people's opinions about the guy, I think that there were moments where just by the energy and by the discussions present on Twitter, you could go, "Oh, he's going to win,"
Right,
or
right, yeah,
"Oh, he has enough support that he's a serious contender. Maybe we shouldn't laugh at that."
right. And so, and yeah, I'm not making a political comment about Trump. I'm just making the point that
Oh, we could see it coming.
yes, that the most prescient and clear-headed and insightful cultural commentators are
Mm-hmm.
writing tweets, and that if you follow them and you listen to them, you can kind of predict where the mainstream is going. How do you tell us a little bit about what you do off Twitter?
Well, off Twitter, I operate a private psychotherapy practice online. It is a true delight. I love doing it. I have to be careful though, because on Twitter, I don't do psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm.
So, a lot of people will try to have conversations or talk about therapy, or I might say something that's a joke or entertaining, or I might say, hey, here's something cool that I think helps people. It's important to recognize that that's not psychotherapy. My online practice is really not about my own agenda or anything of that nature. It's really more about what patients want to get out of it. But I would say that that's mostly what I do outside of offside of Twitter, at least professionally.
Yes, I don't know if speaking of that and speaking of Twitter, I don't know. You probably did not see this, but you tweeted a joke today, and the joke was two social workers see a man stabbed on the ground and they become very alarmed and they say, the person who did this needs help. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I retweeted that with just the word true because I've worked in social work environments.
Mm-hmm.
And that attracted some young man to come and give me a lecture about how problematic it was to
Yep.
to make a joke about people who believe in rehabilitation. To which I responded, I think what's really the problem is that you don't understand humor. But that seemed like the perfect encapsulation of Twitter. Like
Of
you made
course.
a joke, I retweeted it, and you get a lecture from some guy who only has the ability to lecture. Right?
Well, somebody who's guessing what's in our heart, because anybody who knows me knows how much I admire and respect social workers, especially the ones that I've rubbed elbows with have shaped me and improved me in so many ways. But it's out of love that I tease. But I've come across this even in my training. When I was in grad school, I would go to an open mic night, at some comedy club, tell some really bad jokes, but I'll say something like Alzheimer's disease, very terrible condition, but there's a silver lining to it. You can hide your own Easter eggs, right? So like I tell this joke, I get a laugh, and someone comes up after me and says, "You are a mental health professional," and that is blah 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 blah. Because they don't understand where that comes from. They don't understand my own interactions with maybe family members who've had Alzheimer's. Maybe even they are the ones who told me that joke.
That raises an important point, though. And that is, and you see this actually a lot on Twitter, people have a lot of misconceptions and ideas about what therapy is, what it's supposed to do, and what the role of the therapist is. And the
Hmm.
reason that they get offended that you would tell a joke at a comedy club is, and I think this, see what you think, is that there is a widespread misconception that um, therapists are empathy professionals and that their sole job is to never say anything that might make someone uncomfortable.
Yeah, especially during our off hours, like we go looking to listen to people talk about their deepest hurts in our free
Right.
time.
Well,
Yeah.
and also, and in the example you gave, people go to a comedy club to hear things that make them uncomfortable.
Hmm.
That's why we like it. Um, but can you tell me a little bit? I mean, do you see that sort of thing where people have this misconception? And there's so much anti-therapy talk on Twitter too.
Hmm.
Do you see that? And what do you think of that?
I see it all the time. I think it's to be expected though, because a lot of times people will have their own experiences with maybe a mental health professional, right? And they have that certain expectations, maybe even expectations that we have to be saintly and perfect and in every way, shape, or form. But
Mhm.
that's their expectations. That's their standard. And sometimes being able to challenge that helps them have a better idea of what psychotherapy is or even what their own expectations are. But kind of to your point on the off hours, we're not therapy, or we're not doing therapists when we're not therapists when we're not doing psychotherapy.
Mhm.
So like we have free range to be just regular normal people, flawed, maybe even occasionally insulting, right? But
Right.
I guess there's the reality that there are people out there who've been really touched by some of these mental conditions. Maybe they've been really hurt by a family member with Alzheimer's, and that joke does bring up a very real pain. So that
Yeah.
anger and expectation, I kind of expect it. And they will be able to talk about it. Nobody should make jokes about Alzheimer's, or no mental health professional should make a joke about Alzheimer's. But that, again, that's to be expected. That's their expectation. Me challenging that, I think, helps them understand themselves a little bit better. But that's what I do. I feel like I'm getting off track here.
No, that's good. I think that's true. I saw a reel on Instagram
Mm-hmm.
of a therapist advertising her services, essentially. She was sitting in a chair as there, in a wingback, a very comfortable wingback chair, as the sort of stereotypical mental image of the therapist does. And I believe she
Mm-hmm.
had a mug of hot tea in her hand because that's what therapists do, right? Um, and there's an off-camera voice that says, "Don't you want to judge me at least a little bit?" To which this therapist responds, "Nope, that's not how I roll." And I thought, this is a therapist I would never recommend because, as you're saying, therapists are human beings and therapists make judgments. And to deny that about themselves is to, in a sense, deny their own humanity. And how could a therapist help to bring the fullness of a person's humanity forward if they can't handle their own, what technically is called counter transference, their feelings about their client?
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying? And that's the image of
Absolutely.
that's the cultivated image of the therapist as sort of this all benevolent, not even all benevolent, but just almost inhuman being who can make no moral judgments,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Well, I think that's where the comparison with priests really rubs me the wrong way,
Mm.
because that we are not we don't hold ourselves to any kind of like saint like standard. Now
Right.
we have ethics, we have ethical guidelines. We don't want to break the law, we don't want to cause harm, but like yeah, we're full human beings. We make mistakes. We sometimes have, contradicting beliefs.
But
But I
also, go ahead.
no, please. I
Well, isn't it the case that the therapist's moral judgment is
mhm.
one of the tools that he or she uses to help the client? So if a man comes to you and says, everything's fine, just, a couple times a week, I, you know, I black my wife's eyes, or sometimes I don't hit her that hard. Sometimes and sometimes I just hit her with, something softer. How isn't it part of your tool to simply assume that men ought not hit their wives?
Well, I think that's a really good example because there's a difference between being non-judgmental and not having any judgment. Because like we
Mm-hmm.
have judgment, we know, oh, okay, yeah, hitting people, that's most people don't like being slugged in the eye and getting black eyes. How do
Right.
you justify that? How are you justifying maybe even morally hitting your wife every day? It's not my position to go, "Oh, you're a monster. You're a jerk. You need to go into this immediate rehabilitation for your evil deeds."
Mm-hmm.
It's like how do you justify how do you justify that thing that most people would agree don't like getting hit socked in the eye? But
Mm-hmm.
to me, that's the difference between being non-judgmental and not having judgment. If somebody says, "Oh yeah, I won't judge you for that," they're probably lying.
Yes, that's what that's why I saw this therapist on Instagram and I thought, she's lying,
Hmm.
right? Because certainly she would believe so certainly she would believe that overt judgment of something like of a client's behavior is
Hmm.
she would believe she would judge that, right? She would judge overt judgment
Hmm.
of a client's behavior. But trying more deeply, I think this we can have a distinction between judgment and condemnation, and that as a therapist, I would not be happy about a therapist who acted as if he did not know whether punching your wife in the face was a good thing or a bad thing. I don't know.
Hmm.
Like, I mean, there are just certain things. Now, I understand there are some cultures where punching your wife in the face is regarded as not that big a deal, but I think that's wrong.
Right.
And um, and I think you're touching on that when you say so. The goal is not to say to the guy, "Oh, you're a monster," but rather
Hmm.
tell me more about that. What happens to
Well,
you just before that?
I also think so. A more concrete example, something that I see a lot is people will come to me because they're looking for help with romance. It's hard to date in 2024. And, some people are looking for romance. And I do think the motivation is important. So if
Mm,
they were saying, hey, I want to help manipulate women to sleep with me more, even though I don't have any interest in committing to them, I just want to get better at lying and getting them to do what I want
mm,
ethically, morally, I would say no, thank you. I'm not going to help you with that. That kind of goes against something that you know, I'm going to get. I'd be
mhm,
happy to explore why you want to do that, but I will not help you manipulate someone for your own
mm,
endeavors. But at the same time, if they gave me the exact same thing, hey, I have trouble dating, but I want to get married, I want to, grow, I want to develop, and I want to get better at it. I'll go, okay, let's come up with a plan or maybe like a behavioral hierarchy that can increase your likelihood of meeting women and getting the dates that you want.
mhm.
The treatment might look the same, but I would have judgment and say, I'm not going to equip you with those skills because I don't want to contribute to that kind of
Sure. And ultimately, they're
behavior.
destructive to your client,
I
right?
think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's the difference between being non-judgmental and having judgment. Like
Right.
we have judgment, or at least I hope so. I would hope they have
Sure. Sure.
judgment.
Sure. I mean, if you didn't have judgment, And how would you even know how to do therapy? So if the guy comes in and says, a couple times a week I beat my wife, the only
Hmm.
way you know that's something worth exploring is because you already judged it as something he shouldn't do, right?
Yeah, I
You
can
see it
probably
as a
guess that
problem.
wife doesn't like it.
Right, right, right.
Right.
And you said you see a lot of the anti-therapy talk on Twitter too. What do you
Hmm.
make of that?
Well, I think a lot of people base their judgments off their own past experiences. And unfortunately, a lot of people's first experience with mental health care is when they're young or maybe after some criminal behavior.
Hmm.
So very often therapy is mandated. It's forced upon them, sometimes even by a parent. Maybe they haven't done anything wrong, but a parent just says, you're going to therapy and they're going to fix you. We don't
Sometimes they
love
do.
you.
Sometimes they do that because the parent needs therapy.
I think my bias is it's the parents is the one that needs the therapy.
Hmm. Hmm.
But a lot of the times people you can't force therapy on another person. And kids or teenagers, if they're coming to therapy and they're crossing their arms and a therapist doing their best to interact with them, that kid's going to carry that memory forward. They don't
Hmm.
realize as an adult when they have their own goals, when they want to work on something of their own volition, that that's the person that they go to and say, this is what I personally want to work on. It's a different relationship than this is what my dad wants me to work on, or this is what my mom wants me to work on, or this is what the state wants me to work on.
Right. Right.
So I think a lot of people's bad experiences with therapy come from how they're first introduced to it. A lot of people are introduced through it through the media, through television.
Mm.
Some kind of old idea of some stuffy dude with a white beard who sits on a couch and
What do
just
you got
says
against
nothing.
guys with white beards?
What's wrong? What's wrong with the Gandalf beard, right?
Right, right, right.
Well, one thing that's no longer representative of the field. The field is
That's
only 24% male, and very few of
mm,
them, not all of them are wizened with the gray.
bearded.
Yeah,
Only 24% male. Isn't that incredible?
I think so, especially because the stereotype, what's still constantly portrayed is old stuffy white guy.
Mm, That raises two questions. First of all, let me give you my sense of where a lot of the anti therapy talk comes from. See what you think. I
Okay.
think it actually comes from something even deeper, more deeply rooted. And that is, I think there is a widespread, and you see it all over our corner of Twitter, a widespread dissatisfaction with modernity. And that life as it is experienced societally is experienced as meaningless and awful.
Hmm.
And I don't know, I'm sure you've seen on Twitter like the trad people and return all those people, which I mean, I'm not hostile to that. Um, they have good points. They have some good points, right? Um, but I think that in their minds, therapy is two things. It is the safety valve toward which people are pointed to learn how to cope with a terrible society. And so I think probably in their mind they see the enterprise of therapy itself as almost a kind of political institution that keeps the status quo in place. I suspect too that they see it as pointless because a lot of the post Carl Rogers sort of therapist as unconditionally positively regarding you and listening pass almost is perceived as a kind of passivity in the face of massive suffering.
Hmm.
And then I think a lot of the anti-therapy things comes from the fact that Twitter is a lot of angry young dudes and the field is 24% male.
I think you make a lot of good points. If I were to wrestle with a few
Go
pieces,
for it.
I think that I actually want to compliment some of these people in our realm of Twitter. They're very ambitious.
Hmm.
And I very often see ambitious clients. Like I cut my teeth working with military populations. You know, some people where you give them a task, they're gonna figure out how to do it. They're
Sure.
gonna get it done. Like that's their strength. But you know, these ambitious people, very often they're living with a very critical superego. Do more, do better, do more, do better. And
Mhm.
it works. It actually helps them do more and do better.
Yeah.
And when they're confronted with a therapist who says, hey, you know, it's great that that's helping you. It's great that that's helping you accomplish your goals. But at some point, you know, you got to fight your superego because some of those areas you're really just chipping away at yourself or you're eroding yourself. Here are areas where maybe you need to care a little bit less or try or learn to take care of yourself instead of try harder to get more stuff done.
Hmm.
And a lot of ambitious people wrestle with that because the feedback is, hey, you know, maybe the task isn't to do more. Maybe the task is to do less. Versus people who are maybe stuck when, of course, maybe they need motivation. Maybe they need to do more. Maybe they need to get their life together in some way, shape, or form. But that's not a problem that the ambitious have. The problem the ambitious have is they need to stop and smell the roses sometimes.
And maybe the connection there is that when you are on Twitter, for example, where the population is that we're talking about, you have a
Mm-hmm.
lot of young men who some of whom are very serious about their purpose, which is the total revolution of Western society. And
Right.
they're, you know, and maybe
Putting their values on other people. You should believe what I believe too. You
sure, and
know.
the capture retaking institutions, rebuilding alternative institutions, all these things that you hear about among those people who are very, as you said, motivated by a
Mm-hmm.
kind of, honestly, by a kind of political vision that 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 seeks a very fundamental social change, and that I think
Mm-hmm.
maybe therapy
Well,
seems like an enemy to them for that.
I want to wrestle with this a little bit because I don't think that self-improvement falls on a political spectrum per se, but I do think that this idea of personal responsibility
Hmm.
tends to be somewhat right-leaning. You build your own life, you do your own thing, you get what you put into things.
Hmm.
And I think that's the message that is often broadcast by these people that say you can essentially manifest your own destiny by putting in the work, by putting in more blood, more sweat, and more tears.
Right.
So I do think that but kind of to my point that different social medias, Twitter attracts a certain type of person. I think
Mhm.
it is just more likely to attract the kind of person who is maybe internal locus of control. I can build my own life, and if I did it, you can do it too. That's not true. It's you should do it too. That's
Mhm.
usually how it's communicated. I'm not really big on the message of you have to do it exactly the same way I did it or you're wrong.
Sure.
I
Sure.
feel like that message by anybody is typically misguided or inaccurate, not entirely accurate.
Hmm. 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 The the other thing you see there is a view of therapy as if it's a monolith. This is one of the things I harp about a lot is that these guys that are on there saying all these things, and I just keep saying, this is a criticism of therapy by someone who doesn't know what therapy is.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, we were just discussing, I think, before we started recording, a tweet by Jonathan Shedler, whom we both follow, this week, where he was talking about how the mental health system, if you want to call it that, is the Wild
Mm-hmm.
West now. And there is no monolithic understanding of what therapy is.
Right.
And what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's a very complicated topic because I have a good idea of it because I'm in the trenches. So I know what the different licenses are. I know what the different degrees mean. I can get a kind of an idea of what the different trainings or theoretical orientations are. But your average Joe or your average Jane who's looking for therapy, they have no idea. And a lot of times I think it's not just that there are different methods of psychotherapy, different theories of change. There are also institutional confines. Because
Mm-hmm.
I've worked in agencies where my hands were tied, where I would love to have worked harder or have approached a modality in a different direction, but because of the limited funding, the limited resources, or an astronomical wait list that we're trying to see as many people as possible, we have to put limits on the kind of care that we do.
Right.
So, is it psychotherapy? Yeah, sure. Is it effective? Yeah, okay. It can be. Is it
Mm-hmm.
optimal? Is it best? No. There are other conditions and other situations that would probably be more conducive to most people. And that's
Mm-hmm.
the sort of thing that I think your average therapy pursuant, whatever we'd call them, doesn't understand or doesn't notice. And I think we could do a lot better. I think we, speaking for the mental health system, could do a lot better of saying these are the different types of therapy or the different types of providers who do therapy. It's not that one is better or worse, but like medication, you want to get the right one for the problem that you're trying to solve. And fit is very important when it comes to psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm. For sure. For sure. The I suspect some of it too is that the mental health field is being disrupted by the decentralization of everything, just like every other field.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things you hear about is you're going to be replaced by AI.
Uh-huh.
ChatGPT can give you psychotherapy just as well as a human being that you have to pay. ChatGPT will do it for free.
Right. If we never interacted with humans and we didn't relate to other humans as humans, then maybe AI can do that. But I think
Right.
until that happens, well, even if that did happen, I'm pretty sure I would treat them. I would treat them for only connecting with AI and not humans.
Right.
That would
Right.
have that would probably be problematic.
Exactly. Doesn't
Uh-huh.
doesn't thinking that you can get therapy from a machine
Hmm.
constitute the symptom of some kind of psychopathology itself? The very fact that you would
Exactly.
believe that. Right.
But I want to jump on this idea of decentralization because a
Mm-hmm.
lot of that has been a movement from within the field.
Mm-hmm.
I've had a lot of conversations over something superficial like attire.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there has been a deliberate movement within psychotherapy to become more casual, to
Mm-hmm.
dress down in psychotherapy because we want to humanize ourselves, call us by our first name, we're on the same level. We just have different life experiences. I probably just read a few more textbooks in behavior than you, but you know your life better than me. And I don't have a problem with that, but I do think that people will still judge books by covers. I think
Mm-hmm.
there is an impact of that. If I
Oh,
showed up in sweats with a stain on my shirt, people probably wouldn't take me as seriously, even though my actual capacity to do psychotherapy isn't different. So I do think some of these movements to decentralize psychotherapy has, in many ways, I don't want to say delegitimized it, but made it seem a little bit less professional and potent than it is.
the the other thing, of course, is the rise of online gurus and the fact that
Uh-huh.
literally anyone can call himself a coach. And I call
Hmm.
myself a coach. So I'm very cognizant of what that means um, and how bad that can be. You know, and that people sort of see other people who, with literally zero training in anything, except for the ability to market themselves as kind of, I can solve this one specific problem for you.
Hmm.
They see that as an alternative to any kind of any kind of real therapeutic work they might do.
Right.
Do you see that? Do you see that happening?
I do see that happening, but I think you're kind of also identifying that there is a spectrum, right? So like what is the qualification to be a life coach? A
Mm-hmm.
life. You have to have a pulse. Bam, now
Right.
you can be a life coach. That
Right.
doesn't mean that if you do have one specific problem and you go to somebody who knows how to help you with that problem, that a coach could be a better fit than even a psychologist,
Mm-hmm.
because that's the person who's going to help you develop mastery in maybe a very specific behavior. I think diet and exercise are the best examples of that, right? So like personal trainers and nutritionists as coaches,
Right.
they're going to, if your goal is to improve your nutrition or to get, to actually figure out and develop a fitness program, a coach is where it's at. It's like medication. You get the right dose for the right problem you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
It's just how do you figure out the difference between a qualified professional who can solve your problem and, your neighbor Greg who has a webcam.
Right. Right. And in some sense I do have like a kind of libertarian impulse around that, in the sense that, well, let Greg say it. Like, let somebody go have a session with Greg, and then let them come have a session with me and see if they can tell a difference, because I would hope that they can, right?
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, I suppose this has always been the case in the public market, but people are vulnerable to people who are essentially dishonest.
Yep. The marketing and advertising is the dark side of psychology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I also think that it's gonna be like a horseshoe, right? Because you're the most successful people on one end is going to be the best con men, and
Mm-hmm.
on the other hand, it's going to be the most competent.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're seeing it here in the digital era, where we now have webcams or cameras that we can communicate in every country in the world, fully globalized, and yet most psychotherapy licenses or social work licenses, psychology licenses are still by the state. So like I have an interjurisdictional license that allows me to do online therapy in about 43 different states,
Mm-hmm.
but the most competent people who actually get results and deliver, they're not going to want to be confined by a state licensure. So they're going to either retire their license, or they're just going to get their training, and then they're going to open their coaching business and be successful because they're maybe good at coaching.
Mm-hmm.
But they're thinking, why would I confine myself? Why would I hamstring myself with a license to practice psychotherapy?
Right. And again, I by no means intend to. I mean, I know coaches who have almost no formal um, training of any kind, who are
Mm-hmm.
brilliant at what they do. I can think of one who, with whom I worked 2 or 3 years ago, who made massive positive impact on me. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so by no means do I mean to sort of denigrate the whole industry, if you want to call it that. But I do have but I do have this concern that the coaching industry tends to kind of get people thinking that what they need to do is solve each of their individual problems, as opposed to a more psychotherapeutic approach, which is about you growing as a person. Do you understand
Yeah,
that?
more developmental, more like longitudinal developmental. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and just in terms of coaching, it's like, well, somebody's coming to you to say, tell me how to solve this specific problem. Well, ultimately, that you solve that problem by doing something like psychotherapy. You need to understand yourself much more deeply.
Well, in psychotherapy, sometimes they realize that the problem they thought was the problem wasn't the problem. So I
Yes.
think almost every client I've ever had since I became a therapist has had some health goal. Either it's diet, exercise, sleep, whatever, just healthier choices in one degree
Right.
or whatsoever. Let's say it's diet. Let's say they come to psychotherapy. They say, I just eat junk food all day and I want to lose weight.
Mhm.
At some point in time in the psychotherapy, they might determine, hey, you know what? I like having cheeseburgers and milkshakes. I prefer that than having a six pack. Maybe my desire to lose weight was misguided. Maybe my real goal is to be healthy but not not have the who cares what I actually look like, because I'd rather have a I'd rather eat sugar every once in a while, right?
Right. Mhm.
That's me. That's my example. I'd rather have cheeseburgers and a milkshake occasionally than a six pack. But I like to eat clean as much as I can.
Hmm. Hmm. Right. The we talked a little bit too before we started recording about sort of the state of young men. I'm wondering, and if you find that you have a lot of frustrated young men among your clientele.
hmm I would say about a third of my clients are under 30, just
All,
new adult men.
what kinds of things do they come to you presenting?
A lot of it's professional. A
Mm,
lot of it's vocational. They want to have a meaningful career, and they are not really happy with prospects or the landscape of career development. Maybe they're in gig or job economies and they're not really developing a career, and that's important to them.
mhm.
Another one is relationships. They, for almost the same reason, they look at the landscape of relationships and they are cautious or they're jaded or and sometimes just furious and angry and going their own way. I work with people, sometimes they've gone a year or two without even pursuing romance because they're just fed
Right.
up with it. So I think very often it is a matter of personal development, but the motivation piece, because they're looking at the landscape of really what the culture has been in the United States for a while, and they just think, what's the point? Why would I work so hard for so little?
That's what I was bringing up earlier. Is how do you help someone psychotherapeutically when they are making a social critique that is valid? Do you see? Because on one hand, you have to say, yes, I see that your social critique is valid. On the other hand, we have to sort of disregard that so that you have some inward locus of control.
hmm
How do
I
you
mean,
do that?
part of the job of psychotherapy is to get people as connected to reality as possible. And the reality is that maybe the landscape is a little barren or it's a little challenging, but then they get to find their own motivation to do it anyway, or what they're willing to pursue. But it is entirely up to them what to care about. I can't tell them what jobs to take or who to date or who to break up with.
Mhm.
But by examining their value system, I think they get a little bit more connected into their why. So so let's say it is a low chance that I get a meaningful career, or that the probability is low that the women the next date I go on is going to be somebody I want to marry. What do you need to do it anyway? What do you need to do to increase the chances of you getting the outcome that you want, even though we can't predict when, if at all, you get the outcome that you want?
Yes, that's good. Is to say, I suppose that what you're saying is that at some level, for those guys who are angry about the social situation,
hmm
valid as their critique may be, the volume on that has to be turned down a little bit, and the volume on their connection to themselves has to be turned up because they can't hear that.
Yes, and I think there's an old army saying, "Embrace the suck."
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think psychologically, to some degree, we all have to face a reality. I think there's a Buddhist principle that life is suffering.
Hmm. Hmm.
But to embrace the reality that to get what we want, sometimes we have to wade through something very uncomfortable.
Hmm. Hmm.
And sometimes that's a matter of accepting, or at least the difference between accepting and condoning. Do we
Hmm.
condone the that maybe it's a low chance of them being homeowners? No, absolutely not. Economically, that's devastating. But do we
Hmm.
accept it? Well, we don't really have a choice. That's the reality at this time until things change.
Right.
Probably not homeownership.
Right. Right.
I
So
hope I'm
accept
making
that.
sense with that example.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's something you have to accept. And then, given that constraint, how do you make the most of your experience?
Yeah, in
Mm.
in reality,
Right.
realistically,
Mhm.
because we can escape to fantasy. I don't think it's ever been easier in history to escape into fantasy. In fact, culture, American culture primarily, is so primed that we can pick one fandom. Let's say it's Star Wars. We have endless Star Wars content. We can only watch Star Wars for the rest of our life, and we can still get new content every year. There's a new Lord of the Rings television show. I think they're making new Harry Potter stuff. So like it has never been easier to escape into fantasy. And I have nothing against that. It's very adaptive, especially on the short term. You can kind of forget life's troubles for a while.
Mm-hmm.
But it's when it becomes maybe too rigid, maybe, used too often. We
Mm-hmm.
have to get people back connected into reality. And to your point about a lot of angry young men, sometimes their fantasy is an extreme version of their probability. So like maybe they are turned down for dates, or maybe they haven't gotten, they've gone to a lot of job interviews and they haven't gotten, hired yet. Their fantasy is going to be in a very extreme version of that workplaces are hostile and they're unwanted
Right.
and unemployable. Realistically, that's not the case. There's still a probability that they have to get hired and they still have to pound the pavement, so to speak. Otherwise,
Right.
they will never get a job.
Right. 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 Right.
That's the reality.
What do you think? This I'll ask this, then we'll wrap up because we've gone an hour or so. What do you think young men culturally need that they're not getting?
Opportunity to learn and grow with their two hands,
Mm.
like actually getting out of the house and learning a skill, developing a skill, not even obtaining it, just the pursuit of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same with socializing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not even about them having a best friend or a girlfriend on track towards marriage. It's the opportunity to go out in the world and connect with people. I guess there's this idea of the third spaces, like your home,
Sure.
your work, and then the third spaces. Like people don't have anywhere to go. I worked with a handful of people who graduated high school around 2020. Like they were that silent graduation where they had like drive-throughs where you just drive your car and it's a procession because you can't
Right.
breathe. You had to.
Right.
They entered society without ever being formally invited into society.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people don't understand the psychological impact of that because now these people are 22, 23 years old and they don't know how to just get up and go to the bar. They don't know how to go to a restaurant and talk to a stranger because they've never been formally invited to society. Society was shut down when they became adults.
That's a good point. Also, and I probably shouldn't bring this up because it opens another can of worms for us to discuss, but I've thought a lot about generational testosterone loss, which is very well documented, and
Scary.
I can just and I can I've worked with students for years, and I can see in a classroom now a big difference between the way boys ish, men ish at 20, 21, 19, 20, 21 relate to the girls in the class now versus how we boys when I was in college in the 90s, how did we relate to the girls, right? And now it's very respectful and very anodyne and very androgynous.
Mm-hmm.
Even in the 90s, it was, which one of these girls am I going to sit next to so I can talk to her next time? And that does not happen now. Right? Like there's no like going into class and sitting down next to the girl you saw last week and being like, "Hey, this is me and who are you?" That
Mm-hmm.
doesn't happen. And I just wonder if
Right.
if there's not a lack of biological drive for that.
Well, I think there are a couple pieces of that puzzle, but yeah, the biological one is, I think a lot of it's cultural, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like I grew up in an era without camcorder or like security cameras, like
Sure.
looking down at us. I imagine you did as well.
Uh-huh.
I actually remember when they started installing them, sometimes after maybe I did something that I shouldn't have when I was a
Right.
young whippersnapper.
Mm-mm.
But it was because I had those experiences, maybe like running from a security guard, that I would get these rushes of testosterone. It was
Mhm.
danger, right? It was
Right.
real threat. I think a lot of kids, they're not exposed to any risk.
Mhm.
I don't see kids riding their bike around the neighborhood. When I was 10 years old and I got on my bike, I was gone and I didn't have somebody looking over my shoulder.
Yeah.
So these
Yeah.
there's almost this, there is a risk aversion. I don't want to blame
Mhm.
them. I might blame their parents a little
Culturally,
bit,
right.
but
Culturally, it's grown up that way. The risk
mhm.
aversion. Yeah.
Yeah, but I also think it's social, right? If you get rejected, sometimes people will screen capture the rejection on the phone and then they're going to send it to all of their friends, and nobody wants their reputation ruined.
Mhm.
In person, it can be even more risky, even if they never really develop the eye contact or the confidence. They could get real social consequences to saying the wrong thing to the wrong person at the wrong time. And so I
Mm.
think there is that more natural apprehension that ends
Mhm.
up ruining it for everybody, because I meet a lot of these young women who say nobody chases me, nobody asks me out, nobody makes me feel pretty when I'm just out
Right.
and about. No,
Nobody comes up to and that sits next to me in class and asks what my name is.
right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for talking. I feel like, I say this every time, but I have guests on and I feel like we just barely scratched the surface of anything. So maybe we'll have to do it again.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Part two is sounds like a great idea.
All right. Thank you very much. We'll talk soon.
Yeah, my pleasure.